All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're tackling a topic that always seems to get people fired up in the JavaScript world, classes.
Yeah, it's the one of those things that developers can have really strong feelings about.
To put it mildly, right. So, are classes this elegant way to bring order to our code, or are they just an awkward leftover from other languages, kind of shoehorned into JavaScript where they don't belong?
It's a good question, and it's one we're going to unpack today.
Awesome, I'm ready to get into it. We've all heard the argument, right? JavaScript is a functional language, so classes are like the enemy. I've even seen some pretty intense debates online about it.
Oh, for sure. And I get it. JavaScript does have deep roots in functional programming. It gives you a lot of flexibility.
It does, but does
Yeah?
that mean classes are automatically a no-go?
Not necessarily. Here's the thing. JavaScript isn't limited to just one way of doing things. We call it a multi-paradigm language,
Multi-paradigm meaning.
meaning it can handle both object-oriented programming, which is where classes come in, and functional programming.
So it's not an either-or situation?
Exactly. It's more like having different tools for different jobs.
Like you wouldn't use a screwdriver to hammer in a nail, right?
Precisely. Sometimes you need a hammer, and sometimes you need a screwdriver.
Makes sense. Okay, so let's talk about one of the biggest concerns people seem to have with JavaScript classes, the whole performance thing. Is there any truth to the idea that classes will slow down your code?
Ah, the myth of slow and inefficient classes. It's a common one, but it often ignores how JavaScript actually works, especially in today's browsers.
Okay, so what's really going on under the hood?
Well, it all comes down to the JavaScript engine. This is the part of your browser that takes your code and makes it run. And modern JavaScript engines, like V8, which you'll find in Chrome and Node.js, they're pretty amazing.
In what way?
Well, they use this technique called just-in-time compilation, JIT for short, and basically it optimizes your code as it's running.
So it's not just reading the code line by line?
It's analyzing it, looking for ways to make it faster on the fly.
Wow, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, and V8 in particular has this component called turbofan, and it's really good at this optimization stuff.
Okay, so where do classes fit into all of this?
Well, turbofan, it uses information from another part of V8 called ignition to figure out which parts of your code are being used the most. And guess what? This optimization process, it works really well for classes.
Really? So the more you use classes, the better they perform?
In a way, yeah.
Hmm.
But it gets even more interesting. V8 also uses these mechanisms called hidden classes and inline caching to make classes even faster.
Hidden classes, inline caching. Those sound like secret weapons. Can you break those down for us? What are they exactly?
Sure. Imagine you're organizing a huge library, right?
Yeah.
You wouldn't just throw books on shelves randomly, would you?
Chaos. Total chaos.
Right. You'd want a system, some kind of catalog, so you could find things quickly.
Absolutely. Organization is key.
Exactly. And that's kind of what hidden classes are for V8. They're like a way to organize the properties within your classes so that V8 can access them super fast. When you define your class properties consistently, V8 can create these hidden classes. They're like a streamlined lookup table.
So it's all about making V8's job easier.
Exactly. Now, inline caching that comes into play when you're calling methods on your classes. Let's say you've got a method that calculates a discount on a product price.
Okay, I'm following.
The first time you call that method, V8, it remembers the types of data you're using, like maybe a number for the price and a percentage for the discount.
Got it.
So the next time you call that same method with similar data types, V8 already knows what to expect, and it can skip some of the usual steps, making things faster.
Like taking a shortcut. The more you use it, the faster it gets.
Exactly. So to be clear, this whole thing about classes being inherently slow, it's a bit of a myth, especially with all these optimizations happening in modern JavaScript engines.
That's good to know. So if performance isn't a deal breaker, why were people making such a fuss when React moved away from classes a while back?
Yeah, that definitely got people talking. For a while there, I was wondering if I needed to rethink all my code.
I think it threw a lot of people for a loop. But like with anything in the development world, there's always more to the story.
So what was the real reason behind React's shift?
It really came down to React's own internal architecture and how they wanted to simplify state management within components. They introduced this thing called hooks, which, to put it simply, let you hook into React features from within function components.
So kind of a way to achieve what classes did, but with a more functional approach.
Exactly. It wasn't that classes were inherently bad, just that React found a different way to handle things that worked better for their specific needs. Makes sense. And to be clear, React still supports classes, right?
Absolutely. Developers can use whatever approach works best for them and their projects.
Okay, that makes me feel better. It seems like understanding the why behind these changes is super important. But let's switch gears for a bit. We've talked about the potential downsides and misconceptions, but let's talk about why someone might actually choose to use classes in their JavaScript code. What are the big wins?
Well, for me, one of the biggest advantages is the structure and organization that classes can bring, especially as your projects get larger and more complex.
So if I'm building a simple to-do list app, maybe I don't need classes. But if I'm working on a big, complex web application, that's where they really shine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Think about something like building an e-commerce site. You've got products, users, shopping carts, payment processing, trying to manage all of that without a clear structure could become a nightmare pretty quickly.
Yeah, I can imagine. So are classes like those little containers we use to organize things, but for code?
That's a great way to put it. Classes give you this blueprint, a way to group related data and functions together in these manageable units.
And that makes it easier to keep track of everything, right?
Exactly. And not just for keeping your code tidy, but it also makes it way easier to maintain and scale things down the road.
Because we all know code can get messy fast. Nobody wants to be stuck trying to decipher a tangled mess of code when they need to fix a bug or add a new feature. Been there, done that.
It's not fun. But when you use classes effectively, you build in this inherent structure that makes it so much easier for you and other developers to understand what's going on. And if you need to add something new, you can often just extend your existing classes without having to rewrite huge chunks of code.
That's super helpful. Okay, you mentioned extending classes, which makes me think of those core object-oriented programming principles,
Yeah.
encapsulation and inheritance. Sometimes I need a little refresher on those. Could we break those down?
Absolutely. So encapsulation is all about bundling data and the methods that operate on that data within a neat little package or class. It's like having this self-contained unit where the internal workings are hidden away from the outside world.
Okay, so it's about controlling access and making sure things don't get too intertwined.
Exactly. You get fine-grained control over what parts of your code can interact with other parts. That makes your code more robust because if you need to make changes within one class, it's less likely to cause unexpected problems somewhere else.
That sounds like a good thing. And what about inheritance? How does that work with classes?
Inheritance is all about code reuse and efficiency. Imagine you're building a video game with different types of characters, like warriors, mages, and rogues. They're all going to share some common traits, right? Like they'll all have health points, strength, maybe some special abilities.
But you wouldn't want to write the code for those traits from scratch for every single character type, right?
Exactly. That's where inheritance comes in. You can create a parent class, let's say character, that defines those shared attributes and methods. Then you can create your warrior, mage, and rogue classes that inherit those common traits from that parent character class.
So it's like a family tree of code with child classes inheriting traits from their parents.
Perfect analogy. And the child classes, they can also have their own unique properties and methods, so you're not limited in what you can create.
So inheritance helps us avoid repeating ourselves in our code. Very cool. We've got structure, maintainability, encapsulation, inheritance. These are some pretty strong arguments for using classes, but there's also the practical side to consider. We don't code in a vacuum. How well do classes actually fit into the broader JavaScript ecosystem?
That's a really important point. I mean, we could talk about the technical details all day, but if classes don't actually work well with the tools and libraries developers use every day, they're not going to be that practical.
Right. And I think this is where it's important to remember that even though there are some developers who are really passionate about sticking to a purely functional approach in JavaScript, a lot of the popular libraries and frameworks we use all the time are actually built around classes.
So trying to completely avoid classes could actually make things more difficult for JavaScript developers. It definitely could. Think about Angular, for example. It's a really popular framework for web applications, and it uses classes extensively for its structure. Components, services, modules, they're all built using classes.
So if you're working with Angular, understanding classes isn't just a nice to have, it's essential. What about React? We talked about how they shifted towards function components and hooks. Do classes still have a place in the React world?
Oh, for sure. While React's core approach has evolved, they still fully support class components. So developers have the flexibility to use the approach that best suits their project.
I like that. It's about having options and choosing what works, rather than being limited by one specific approach.
Exactly. And it's not just limited to Angular and React. A lot of JavaScript libraries and tools use classes in their structure. Ignoring that could mean missing out on some really useful tools and potentially even having to reinvent the wheel when you're trying to work with existing code bases.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so we've talked about the benefits of classes. They bring structure, they can make your code more maintainable, and they're deeply integrated into the JavaScript ecosystem. But like any tool, there are probably some things to watch out for. What are some potential downsides or situations where classes might not be the ideal choice?
You're right, no tool is perfect. One thing to be mindful of when you're working with classes is how you modify objects after you've created them. Remember those optimizations we talked about earlier, like hidden classes and inline caching?
Yeah, those were pretty cool.
They work best when the structure of your objects stays consistent. If you're constantly adding new properties or changing things around after an object has been created, it can mess with those optimizations and potentially impact performance.
So it's not that you can't change things, but being aware of how those changes might affect performance is key.
Absolutely. It's all about using classes in a way that aligns with how JavaScript engines work. And honestly, classes aren't always the answer. Sometimes a simple function or a module is all you need. Don't feel like you need to force classes into every single situation.
Right. It goes back to that idea of having different tools for different jobs. Choose the right tool for the task at hand.
Exactly. And maybe that's the biggest takeaway from all of this. The real debate isn't classes versus functions, but about understanding the strengths and weaknesses of each and figuring out the best way to use them together.
It's not about picking a side. It's about being adaptable and writing the best possible code. I love that.
Exactly. JavaScript is flexible, so take advantage of that. Don't be afraid to mix and match approaches to see what works best for you and your team.
This has been so insightful. I feel like I have a much deeper understanding of not only how classes work in JavaScript, but also their role in the bigger picture. Any final words of wisdom for our listeners before we wrap things up?
I think the most important thing to remember is that JavaScript classes aren't the enemy. They're not trying to replace functional programming or tell you how you have to code. They're just another tool in your toolbox, and a powerful one when used effectively.
I love that. So class is not the enemy, just another tool in our ever-growing JavaScript toolboxes.
Exactly. So keep experimenting, keep learning, and don't be afraid to explore the world of JavaScript classes. You might be surprised at what you discover.
Fantastic advice. And to all our listeners out there, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into JavaScript classes. Until next time, happy coding!